Okay, so now when we go down with it right now, this is what we have to understand, right? When you look into these things, it's important for you to understand that in most cases, the economists, they're going to break down expenditure into two. So they will say that we have induced consumption expenditure and we also have autonomous expenditure, right? But before we jump into these two things, I just want to say something, and please take out your pen and paper and write this down, right? Savings can also be negative, right? Especially in the lower incomes group, right? Sometimes people will consume more than they earn. So that thing is going to cause a dissaving. So when we are talking about dissaving, that is what we mean. We're simply talking about a situation whereby people are actually consuming more than they earn, right? So in that case, we're simply saying that our consumption, for example, we're simply saying that our consumption, which is C, is actually going to exceed my income. That's what we are saying there, right? And then one thing that we need to understand is that how we are going to finance this spending, it is either financed through borrowing, right? Or we can finance it by savings that were accumulated in the past, right? So it's important to understand this, right? So now I want us to move on to induced consumption expenditure. So induced consumption expenditure is actually the expenditure that is caused by an increase or by a decrease in my level of income. So this expenditure is happening because there's an increase in my income, right? So let's write it down over here. This expenditure is happening because why? There is a change in my income. There is a change in income, right? So that's why there's now induced consumption expenditure. But when I jump over to autonomous expenditure, right? This is where now people are consuming even when my YD is actually zero, even when like there's no income. My YD is zero, but people are still consuming. So simply put, the induced consumption expenditure is dependent on income. For this one to increase, there has to be a change in my income. There has to be an increase, right? When there's no income, I don't have induced consumption expenditure. I only have the autonomous expenditure. But the moment now there's income, right? That's where now I have induced, right? And then autonomous expenditure, the income level is actually zero, right? So going back to induced consumption expenditure, this is the key word, change. So the moment I say change, it brings another formula into the game. This is where now we come across the formula that says my change in income is going to be equals to my change in consumption plus my change in savings. Does it make sense? Because the moment we speak of induced consumption expenditure, it simply means that there was a change in income. That's why now the formula is no longer only y equals to c plus s, but the formula now involves what? These triangles, which simply mean change, 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 right? Does it make sense? So that's how we are now going to do this thing, right? But now when we look at autonomous expenditure over here, I'll just give you a basic example. You can even go and check it in your textbook, right? So you will have a situation where now your income is equals to C plus S. But remember, under autonomous expenditure, my income is actually zero, right? But I still have a minimum that I will consume, right? So we can make an example. Let's say in this case, my minimum is actually 4,000, right? So my minimum is 4,000. Remember what we said. It's either we are going to borrow or we are going to use money that we have saved in the past. Then we will have plus S. But the S now is going to be negative 4,000. Does it make sense?